Well, I'd like to welcome you all for coming to celebrate the Constitution Day. The GRCC is doing their annual panel where we discuss the Constitution and its relevance to topics that are going on now, and none better than during a presidential election year, I'm sure. My name is Keith St. Clair. I'm a professor of political science at GRCC, as are my colleagues here. Heather Forrest, immediately to my right, Yen Bai, and then Gordan Vurusic. And as the full-time political science staff, we're faculty. We're certainly pleased to be here and look forward to the many questions that you have for the panel. We'd like to start off with maybe a few opening comments about the Constitution and then get right to the Q&A, if possible. And I, with the microphone, will come around to you if you hold up your hand so that you can be heard on the recording that we're doing today, which should air also on not only on GRCC cable access channel, but also perhaps on YouTube, as so often of our much of our programming. You may or may not have already received copies of the Constitution. These were passed out. If you haven't received one yet, perhaps hold up your hand, and Eric Mullen there in the audience can get one to you if he has them. And with that, I'd like to. We'll start with Heather, who's closest to me. Your comments on the Constitution before we get started with the Q&A.
Well, this is a very broad thing to ask about the relevance of the Constitution. I am somebody who studies the judiciary very closely. So it kind of pains me to take the position that I don't think that the Constitution is all that relevant today. I don't believe that it really binds us in the way that the framers had intended. I believe that the framers intended a much more limited central government with a lot more power to the states, quite honestly, because that was the only way that they could get the Constitution ratified by the individual colonies. But even when it comes to restrictions of rights of individuals, powers of the president, powers of the court, the relative lack of power that Congress actually has, I don't think that the Constitution is all that restrictive on what we do today. I mean, Congress has the power to declare war. We've only declared war 5 times in history, and the last time during World War II. And look at how many times the president has deployed troops overseas. When it comes to foreign policy, president as commander-in-chief, he ends up making a lot of deals behind closed doors that most Americans will obviously never hear about. And I don't know that that's necessarily what the framers had intended, although the flip argument could be, do we really want what the framers had intended, given that they were 55 rich white males who owned a lot of land, were relatively hypocritical, I guess you could say. And, oh yeah, I wouldn't be sitting here if they were still, their opinions were still binding. I couldn't vote. I couldn't enter into a contract. So I'm kind of...
You mean as a woman?
Yeah, pretty much. So...
Just to clarify for you.
Yeah. So, you know, I guess I'm just not as disappointed to not see their idea of what our country should be like really come to fruition 220, 230 years later. So, is the Constitution still relevant today? Meh. A little bit, but not nearly as much as they would have hoped. So.
Yen, do you have a few comments before we open it up?
I think in general, the Constitution is still relevant, but the Constitution of the United States is kind of losing its appeal in the world. Just a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I should say, there were like 170 countries who tried to emulate American Constitution, but today the number is in decline. more and more countries try to copy other countries' constitutions, like European charters of human rights. Even our Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg, who visited South Africa a few years ago, she even said that if I was a new country, I would copy the constitution of South Africa. And that's a remark made by our Justice of Supreme Court. So the question is our constitution really losing its appeal? I think in a sense, it is. Our constitution is kind of old, 250 years old, 255 actually. And also it is very difficult to amend. It is extremely difficult to change. So it is old, also it is difficult to amend. The framers intended that the constitution should be changed according to the times. But on the other hand, they want the constitution not to be so easily amended. We must have the supermajority, which is 2/3 to propose and 3/4 to ratify. That's very difficult. And that's why we only have like 27 amendments. As compared to state constitutions, usually they have like maybe hundreds, like Michigan Constitution. It has been amended for just so many times. So American Constitution is very, very difficult to change. So the question is, how can we keep up with times? And also, there are so many problems we face today. For example, the Electoral College, should that be abolished? That kind of thing. And also, should there be like term limit for the Supreme Court justices? And also, should we enlarge the Congress to cater for more representation? I mean, originally the Constitution says, the House of Congress should be 1 for 30,000. If we go by this ratio, we should have, 1,000 members in the House of Congress, but we have only 435. So it's like 1 to 650,000. Mm-hmm. How can one person represent so many countries in his or her district? The ratio is just too large. So should that be changed? And also, how do we change? Should we go about with holding a national convention rather than just proposing amendments in the Congress? And if we have to go to the national convention, how do we do that? We have never done that before. So if we have the national convention to change the Constitution, what if things go out of hand? Can we control? If everybody wants to change the Constitution, then the Constitution will not be able to exist. So there are many, many questions we have to answer. Yes, I do agree our Constitution is relevant, but it has to be changed. And the process of changing that should be simplified.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Gordan, would you have any opening comments before we throw it out to Q&A?
Sure. As a political scientist, I'm really interested in understanding the relationship between the federal courts, especially the Supreme Court, politics, and the Constitution. I think I always ask my students whether the Supreme Court is influencing politics or not, and I ask them to write a paper about it and to think about it. But I think in order to basically give them an answer in advance, I would say yes, Supreme Court and other federal courts are clearly influenced by politics. Another question is whether federal courts, especially Supreme Court, should be influenced by politics or not. And my answer is yes, it should. And my answer is not, well, Supreme Court and other federal courts should be just looking at the so-called legal side of issues, but should be interested in politics. Let me explain that a little bit better, I think. We have a number of recent Supreme Court cases that dealt with political issues. And for example, one of the cases is so-called Citizens United cases. According to the decision of the majority in the Supreme Court, the corporations, unions, and other organizations do have the power, right, and ability to contribute almost unlimited amounts of money to electoral campaigns. Right? According to that decision, money has become sort of speech. Right? So freedom of speech, according to the Supreme Court decision, basically gives the right to organizations to contribute money to electoral campaigns and thus influence these campaigns. We had Supreme Court decisions in June of this year. We had a Supreme Court decision on Obamacare, right? The question about Obamacare, whether the federal government or Congress is basically allowed to oblige people to have health insurance starting in 2014. And the decision of the Supreme Court is yes, but not according to so-called Commerce Clause, Commerce Clause being the third power in Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution, which says that commerce between states and federal government, between states and foreign nations, and between states and Indian tribes is regulated by the federal government. But Supreme Court said, well, not according to the Commerce Clause, Obamacare can stand, but according to the government power to tax. Then we had a recent decision about immigration law in the state of Arizona, where the Supreme Court basically kicked out part of the law, but basically kept part of the law intact, in the sense that this so-called show me your paper provision, in which the state police is basically allowed to ask the people whom they suspect to be illegal immigrants to ask them for papers. Right? So these particular decisions would not be possible, I think, if the Supreme Court was just looking at the Constitution itself and the rule of law. I think the Supreme Court should have some kind of political conscience in mind when they're thinking about their decision. For example, in Roe versus Wade. In Roe versus Wade, they decided that women do have the right to have abortion in the first trimester of pregnancy based on so-called the right to privacy. But at the same time, the Supreme Court allowed the states themselves to write rules that could restrict this right to abortion. So how come that women do have the right to privacy in federal eyes, but they do not have complete right to privacy in the context of states? So I think there is some kind. I think when I say that Supreme Court should have a political view of things, I mean political view in the sense of understanding politics as ancient Greeks understood politics, and ancient Greeks understood politics as what they call the summum bonum, as they call the higher good. Every person or every member of the society should basically be concerned about contributing to the well-being of the community. Leaders, according to Plato, should be interested more in the well-being of the community rather than in the well-being of themselves as leaders. Right? So I don't think that Supreme Court should be criticized for the influence of politics, but should be recognized that politics is necessary if one understands it in the sense of creating perhaps some higher good in the society. Of course, the problem is always how do you define higher good and whose higher good it is, and whether people can really be interested, or members of the Supreme Court could be interested in understanding politics as the contribution of the higher good. But perhaps that's something that we can talk about during the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Our panelists pointed out several good ideas. I mean, Heather talked about perhaps the Constitution isn't as relevant as it used to be. I certainly can appreciate in some respects that that's true. Certainly civil liberties come to mind. The fact that the United States continues to indefinite detention without trial in the facility known as Guantanamo Bay, depriving people of their right to due process of law, frustrating their appeals for habeas corpus. the targeted assassination of American citizens by U.S. drone attacks by people who are alleged to be part of al-Qaeda, yet no trial to determine that, just the president's belief that these individuals are plotting against the United States, allowing them to be assassinated. Even an individual as recently as 16 years old, I believe in Yemen. And these are alarming things and clearly unconstitutional. So, and yet they persist, they continue. So I think, yeah, perhaps the Constitution isn't as relevant as it used to be. Professor Yen Bai talked about how the Constitution is not easily amended, and yet perhaps it should be amended. He mentioned term limits, for example. And I'm often hearing from my students and people in the public how somehow our system of government is broken. It's almost as if people are losing faith in the U.S. government's ability to function as they see persistent gridlock between the political parties, between the Congress and the president. Is it the Constitution itself that's broken? Is that what needs to be reformed? Or is it just the way we implement it?
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, you, I'm sorry, are you in support of term limits, or do you think that they're a good idea?
I'm opposed to term limits myself.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So I thought you were making a defense for them.
No, I didn't comment on term limits. I was just revisiting that as an idea for reforming the Constitution. He talked about how difficult it is to amend.
Right.
And raised the question of possibly maybe it should be. Gordan talked about the importance of the interpretation of the Constitution and mentioned several Supreme Court rulings and how perhaps many people might perceive that to be the problem. I'm interested anyway what you think. I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Before I do, I just want to mention, as I've been handed this note, that at the conclusion of our event today, a member of Student Congress will be in the lobby to register attendees to vote. And certainly this being an election year, if you're not registered to vote, you need to be 30 days before the election in order to vote. So you might want to take advantage of this opportunity. You know, perhaps it's appropriate that we're doing this panel in an election year like we are. A lot of people seem very disillusioned with both major presidential candidates this year. There doesn't seem to be the excitement that there used to be. Perhaps that malaise is related to the observation I made before, that many people see our system of government as somehow dysfunctional or broken. Anyway, we're certainly interested in what questions you have, perhaps related to some of the topics that I've just referred to and our panel has, or perhaps something that hasn't yet been mentioned. Is there any questions that you have from the audience? I'll come around with the microphone.
Before we open it up to the floor, I want to just mention something about the general malaise of and interest in the elections today.
Yeah.
I guess I kind of disagree. I think that there is quite a bit of media coverage of this election. I just don't know that it's good media coverage. I think it's sensationalized. I think that the way that elections are covered are in an effort to keep people paying attention. The problem is they don't inform the people on the true issues. I just want to remind everybody that we are in this situation in this country because of us. We can blame Congress, we can blame the president, we can blame the court for the decisions that they make, but we are in this situation because we've allowed it to happen. We still have, Gordan was just mentioning before the panel started that some individuals not knowing what Roman numerals were or the order of those in the class when you're referring to the Constitution, and how he thought maybe that should have been established in some of our general education, and I commented that I think we have bigger concerns. I think the fact that we have nearly 60% turnout rate during a presidential election, and I still want people to vote after this, so don't confuse my message here, that the high turnout rate in a presidential election, you're actually choosing a leader that you don't actually choose. The Electoral College does. And during a midterm election, where you elect 435 egotistical maniacs in the House and a third of the Senate every 2 years, you actually have direct control over those individuals. And on a good year, we get maybe a 25% turnout rate. That, to me, is nauseating, because people come in and they talk about not understanding the system, and yet they still believe that we elect the president and that they have some kind of control over the president, and therefore they're going to go out and make a difference in that way. And my biggest concern and my biggest frustration is that you realize we do have control, but it's through Congress. We blame Obama for Obamacare, but who writes the laws? Congress does. So who gave that law to Obama? Congress did. You can blame the president for the economy. You can blame him for the high unemployment rate. You can blame him for the attack on the embassy in Libya. You can blame him for the declining economy and the problem with the euro. But there's only so much control that one man has. And the more control that we have in this country is over our elected representatives. And that is Congress, not the court, not the president, and your state and local officials. We elect our governor in each state. We elect at least in the state of Michigan, we elect all of our judges, and we elect all of our legislators. And yet, people aren't as informed about what goes on at the state and local level, where you have a tremendous amount of control of what goes on at the state and local level, because parties aren't as important and aren't as influential in these state and local elections, because many of them are nonpartisan. There's no party that appears on the ballot. So, I don't know, I guess that's why I find the Constitution a little less relevant today. It's so easily manipulated and changed through, well, both Congress, the president, and you can even throw in the court as well. It's very easily skirted. It's a very vague document. We were just talking about it's probably one of the shortest constitutions in the world. And Gordan mentioned it was relatively, or Yen mentioned it was relatively old, but I looked at this and I think, boy, it's really young. I mean, we're still puppies in the entire, and if you look at, there are hotels older than this Constitution in Scotland, you know? So to say that we are all victims here, I think is a huge, I don't know. I think it's playing the victim.
In other words, there's not, you disagree with the, you wouldn't say that our system is dysfunctional or our system of government is broken.
I wouldn't say, I'm not disagreeing that it's broken, but I want to lay the blame at the feet of the people who are responsible for that, and that's us.
Okay.
So
Gordan. Yeah.
That's my point, is just that we are in this mess because we got us here. Because it's, and it's because we don't know the very basics of our own system. I mean, I get students who come from, I have students who come from other countries, and they know more about our political system and our Constitution and our government than many of the people who just graduated high school.
Because they're afraid of us.
That works for me, as long as you're informed, you know. I often wonder if being the privileged society that we are actually does us in. Maybe ignorance is bliss, and it's not. It's unfortunate, but it's just not. There was a question over there.
Gordan wanted to respond.
Sorry.
To what you said.
I mean, when we say the Constitution is less relevant today than it used to be, I think we are getting ourselves into the trap of good old days mythology. Oh, everything was fine before, but now we are in some kind of decline or decay, and I think that's a little bit of a mythology, because if you, I mean, Heather herself said, well, the United States never officially declared war after World War II, right? Congress
No,
never
those-
said,
those
well,
were
there were certain,
peacekeeping
there were certain
operations.
resolutions,
Right.
right? Gulf of Tonkin resolution, there was a resolution of the use of force in the Iraq War in 2003, but never in these particular congressional resolutions did Congress say, well, we declare war on a particular country. So at least since 1945, it wasn't relevant, right? You can look at Plessy versus Ferguson, right? The idea that African Americans, that segregation between whites and African Americans is fine as long as facilities are so-called equal quality, despite the fact that we already had post-Civil War amendments of the rights of African Americans that sort of, once interpreted, could be interpreted as forbidding segregation. We also had Jim Crow laws that were after 13, 14, and 15 Amendment that basically gave the rights of African Americans to vote. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think the Constitution is as relevant as it always has been. I think we people, as Aristotle famously said, we are political animals, right? We do struggle for power. I mean, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War, and Supreme Court told him that it was wrong, and he said, well, who cares? I mean, so I think we humans are political animals. As Hobbes famously said, we seek for glory, power, and diffidence from others, right? And that's why we deal with these things as we do. I mean, wouldn't it be logical for all of us to get together and try to solve the common problems of the United States, which, I mean, there are plenty of them, right? Rather than fighting for power and trying to destroy, two different parties trying to destroy each other. Why? So why is it, if it's rational for us to all get together and sing Kumbaya, right, and solve the common problems, why is it that we struggle so bitterly against each other in terms of political fights? I think sort of axiomatic, simple answer is that that's a human nature. I mean, if it wasn't, we wouldn't have jobs, we political scientists, right? Because we wouldn't have politics if we didn't struggle for scarce resources, or power being the scarcest of all, right? And the most necessary of all, because if you have power, you have everything else, right? If we were necessarily fundamentally collaborative creatures, I would be unhappy, because I would be a pet store manager instead.
Not to say that pet store managers are unhappy.
That's right, so we are not. So this story, this myth about things are worse than they used to be, I don't think that there's any empirical evidence to claim that. Things has always been the same, because fundamentally as humans, we created certain institutions to prevent ourselves from killing each other when we have a political disagreement, but we still do have political disagreement, which is fundamentally irrational, because we are wasting so much time and energy with these disagreements instead of getting together and resolve the problems. But we still do have disagreements and squander our days and squander our political lives struggling with these disagreements, instead of really, as any fundamental politician would say, rolling up our sleeves and getting to work. So Constitution, I think, is as relevant as it was, because our passion to struggle with each other in political fight is the same as it has always been. It just, perhaps some of the tools changed in terms of weapons that we use. Today we use YouTube and Hulu or Facebook and the media, right? But I don't know, hundreds of years ago we used guns and knives and things like that. So we evolved in terms of the tools, but we didn't evolve in terms of fundamental disagreements.
Can I add a few things here? The Constitution, if you count the amendments, there are 27 amendments. There are 7,000 words. So American Constitution is short, terse, and concise. That means what? That means if you got a short constitution, you need somebody to interpret, to tell us what the law is. So we have a very heavy dependence on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court interprets the law. Every decision it makes, every ruling it makes, it is an interpretation of the Constitution. Now, back to the congressional power to declare war. Originally, the founding fathers wanted the Congress to make war, not to declare war. But after deliberation, they decided, well, the president is commander-in-chief. So the president should make war, but Congress must declare war first. Declare war means to decide whether the country should go to the war. It's not just like formality or declaration. I mean, it's not just a matter of formality. It's a big decision to determine whether our sons and daughters should die in the war. That's the big thing. Now, we have fought about 200 wars abroad. How many of them were declared by the Congress? Only 5. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. And that's all. So without declaration, the president can still bring the troops to other countries. How come? Because every time there's a war, Congress just passed a resolution to authorize the president to use force. So my argument is that the Congress has failed its duty to decide whether we should go to war or not.
Just by passing a resolution?
Right.
Okay, I think I saw a few hands out there. Yeah. Well, please, can we, if you wouldn't mind, we need the mic for the recorded audience at home.
Hi, hello, I'm David Parsons. It's good to see Dr. Bai again. I attended one of his sessions last semester. I'm not as well educated as everybody in here. Even the young ones are probably smarter than I am. Obviously not as well as the doctors up front.
You are very smart, I know that, David.
Experienced maybe, but I think that the main problem, and you're not going to like this, is with the educators, and not at your level, but at middle school and high school levels, where they're not being taught about the Constitution and how government works. It's pathetic, talking with some of the young students around school here, how little that they know. And even cursive writing, they're not even teaching cursive writing anymore in school. I found that hard to believe. I've got a few other things, but I'm going to let it go with that.
I have a question. Do you feel like the level of how individuals are informed about government has decreased? Do you think your generation was educated better? Later generations, do you think it's this generation that is woefully unprepared? Or do you think that it's always been a problem to educate about it?
I do not know, because I
Okay.
have not been there
Right.
since my high school days. I graduated in 1970. I majored in history and government all 4 years in high school, and I enjoyed it.
Right.
But you talk, most of these kids don't even go to vote, let alone understand what their vote does. And I don't know how the education level is established at mid-school and high school, who establishes the curriculum, whether it's the teachers or the principal or school board, I don't know. I assume it's a school board, but somebody's been sleeping on the switch there and letting all this stuff slide. I got a feeling that the teachers union has a lot to do with that too.
Okay. I have a couple of comments that might shed light on it. Certainly, I think we've been seeing this issue of challenging the adequacy of teaching. In the United States, teachers are paid at a much lower level than some of our comparative countries. But I also think in the last 30 or 40 years, and probably many would agree, that the family makeup has changed considerably. Now, instead of having one person at home and one person working, you have two people out of the home, both parents are working, and so maybe you have less of that traditional family nucleus. Whether or not that's a disadvantage or an advantage, who knows, because then if you have both parents working outside the home, you presumably have better educated parents who are working outside the home who bring that back. So the dynamics of the family may have changed. Furthermore, parents' party ID and parents' party affiliation is some of the best in political science, is some of our best indicators about whether or not their children will be of a particular party ID or how politically involved an individual will be. If their parents, I mean, my father, grandfather, my family's just very Republican on one side and very not on the other. Great times at Thanksgiving, by the way. But I think the fact is that our family has been in tune with politics, and so that kind of passes on. So I think that general apathy is contagious. And so those are a couple of things. But I think definitely there are changes in changes on the horizon for teaching. But I think we also have, anecdotal at best, but I have very good friends who are K through 12 teachers, and they're dealing at the very younger age is more and more with behavioral issues than they are with trying to teach the content. And with funding being cut so drastically and so quickly, especially under the current administration in this state, the first things to go are those remedial classes. And so these students who are in the remedial classes, who try and get them to the level of the other students in the class, those sections are being cut, and those students are just being plopped into classrooms. Much like I teach PS 110, we all do, and we have to teach to the students who have, and I'm certainly not complaining, I think it makes for a much more dynamic conversation, the students who pass up Aquinas and Grand Valley and Western because they can't afford it, but also the students who are, they're at a fairly low reading level, and you're trying to teach to both, and you have to reach both. So I'm certainly not trying to make excuses for teachers. I just think that, and I don't necessarily know that there are different circumstances that we haven't faced for 200 years. But to just place it all at the blame of at the feet of the teachers, I think is kind of missing other factors. I know. But I think what you're bringing to light is a lot of what's going on in Chicago right now, too. I mean, the protests and the unions, and yes, I still have friends and former students at Grand Valley who are now down working in Washington, D.C., and they argue with me all the time thinking that unions are no longer necessary because you don't have the workplace problems that you had in the 40s and 50s, and workplace is equal now, and there's no issues, so we don't really need unions, and they're just protecting the bad people. And I don't know. I would agree that the education of our youth is slipping through our fingers. I show a movie in my class every semester, and I'm sorry if I'm dominating. It's called 2 Million Minutes. And if you've never seen it, it's a powerful movie that shows, yes, jaded and cherry-picked and not scientifically sound, but it shows the education of two individuals in the United States. Carmel High School, actually, out of Indiana, I believe, with two individuals from India and two individuals of China. And 2 million minutes is actually the point at which you start high school to the point at which you graduate. And you have 2 million minutes. And what do Americans do with that? What do the people in India do with that? And what do the people in China do with that? Well, you find that the education in the United States is wholly different than that of India and China, but you also find that there are more students on honor roll in India than there are students in the United States. And what our students don't realize is that's what they're competing against. And I think part of that is our problem, because we're not making it known that, you know, the iPhones that they're getting at 13 and 14 years old it's not common throughout the world. I think that's, again, part of our problem, is that we're not making them work hard enough.
Gordon, would you
I'm
like
sorry.
to add anything to that? Or should I turn it over to another question?
I'll just briefly say that I think among my students, I also noticed a general contempt for politics. Part of it is boredom, but other part is contempt, because how they perceive politics before, of course, they come to my class, is
And they lived in
it's just a
Layton's.
collection of very loud and angry sound bites, which I never really tried it. Maybe I should try that. But when usually I should ask them. So when I say politics, what it is that you think about? I think perhaps many of them would say screaming, fight, disagreement, and things like that. Especially if I ask them what they think about politicians. And I'm from a nice family, so I don't want to even think about what they think about politicians, right? So politicians are usually perceived as fairly bad people. Politics is perceived as just a struggle for who is the loudest and who wins a particular day. And I think that's very unfortunate. It is not that, I mean, the fact that they think about politics in that way is not the only thing that is unfortunate. I think they're partly right, because American politics has become sort of a collection of angry sound bites and screaming over each other's heads. I mean, it's very difficult to create discussion about serious issues, or discussion about how to solve very serious problems that bother this country. I mean, if you look at how the two presidential candidates are running the campaign, they're not really talking about having a serious discussion, at least not yet, right? Romney is really afraid to say what he thinks, unless he is in Florida talking to fundraisers. And Obama is also talking in generalities, and he is basically not really saying what really went wrong in the economy in the past, except for saying, well, it's the problem that has been a decade old, and he's not really saying how we go from point A, where we are now, to point B. So I think my students are partly right. I don't want to say that to them in public, just keep it a secret among ourselves, right? But they're partly right that unfortunately American politics have become a collection of angry sound bites and struggle and fight who is going to win a particular day in the media, rather than who is going to win on the seriousness of arguments, right? I hope that changes. I mean, that changes in presidential politics, because we will have, on 3rd of October, we will have the first presidential debate. So I think that will be a great opportunity for both candidates to tell us where they want to take us, right? Or at least, I know that they will say that they are going to take us to a brighter future, but I wonder where this brighter future is. So
I have a feeling we're going to get more out of Jon Stewart's debate with Bill O'Reilly than we will out of the October 3rd debate. And I got to tell you, there's
I
one
hope
I'm
you're
looking
wrong.
a
I
lot
hope
more
you're
look forward to.
I think politicians and media must be blamed too. It's not just students' fault. Politicians know the young people do not vote, so why bother? Why should I, invest in the young people? Why should I spend money and time on the young people? So they don't communicate with young people, students.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to, It's interesting to note that the largest interest group in the United States, as many of you well know, is the AARP. And if you were to gather all college students together and get them into a voting block, they would have just as loud and as powerful of a voice as the AARP. And they would be able to offset a lot of those things that people who vote pursuant to the AARP. And you'd probably see more money available for student loans and lower interest rates on those student loans. So I just worth noting.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hello, my name is Jesse Jones, and I just thought I'd throw out some viewpoints from the youth. I'm a little overaged for that age group, but that's definitely the area that I fit into. And frankly, from our point of view, you know, the youth of America kind of blames the elderly and the older generations, like the baby boomers in particular. That's where we see the blame is. And first of all, those are the major block of voters. Those are the people who are voting in what we have today. Their point of view is what dominates the television and the media. So, you know, from our point of view, they're the ones in the control. And in many aspects of life, you can't change things until the old guard is gone. And so there is some laziness and just waiting for them to die and looking forward to that generation dying out. And there's a lot of isolated hopelessness in the youth. You know, the issues that concern us aren't on TV. And frankly, a lot of us don't see ourselves as Americans. It doesn't help that we're constantly told that we're not real Americans in the media channels, but the youth has grown up with the internet. We've got friends globally. You know, some of my best friends, one of which I saw just this summer, is from Germany. I have a friend who's from Russia, you know, South America. We do a lot of traveling there, you know, to different countries, and we have a community that's global. And unfortunately, in a lot of points, that global community and communication that we have is almost equal to the amount of interaction we have locally. And because of that, you know, we... Yeah.
Yeah, I guess this is a sit-in or something. Sorry, Jesse.
No, it's fine. It's just, you know, a lot of the issues that talk about in the founding of the country about unifying the states on a federal level is a lot of the feelings I think the youth have about multiculturalism and joining together, such as with the UN. And that's kind of the thing that we like. But you know, all of our issues about things like copyright, free use issues, those aren't addressed in the media and in the debates here in America, although the youth has been gaining ground in Europe with the Pirate Party for these types of issues. There's also things like the marijuana legalization issues, but it's dominated by people, you know, like the grandparents and uncles that we have who are still hung up on blacks' segregation issues. And you know, we still have family members that are going off about communism. And as somebody who has a close friend from Russia, I think that it's ludicrous. And frankly, we don't see being American as being an economic system. You know, a lot of us, the difference between capitalism and communism are simple economic issues, and framing one as evil is just, you know, ridiculous. But there's so much hopelessness because our generation does feel isolated because there's no communication. And you're right, I'm also pretty upset that not, you know, so many of the youth aren't getting out and voting. And so it's not that they're uneducated. If you spend any time online in any of the forum boards, there's quite a bit of in-depth discussion that's going on between people. It's
Can I ask you a question?
Mhm.
Do you think we should require young people to vote? Do you think we should pass a law which is mandatory? If you don't, you'll be punished or penalized.
No,
Fine.
punishment,
Taxed.
no, but you know, that's kind of the thing is the most important thing about our freedoms is the freedom to be different. I mean, a lot of issues like whether or not you can be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Well, there's also this idea that you have the right to, that maybe not voting is strategic as well. And so when we talk about people who don't turn out to vote, sometimes that is a rational choice for them.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of things like that, like even people talking about serving in the military as being a condition for citizenship. And I think you guys are missing the important point. Is I know a big part of why there's a hopelessness, besides the fact that the major parties and the news outlets aren't having the conversation that we'd like to have, is the fact that the uselessness of the Constitution is plainly seen. I mean, when we see things like the Iraq War not even being declared as a war, but clearly in violation of Article 6 of the Constitution, and there's nothing that a common person can do about that because it violates the UN treaty, and being a treaty is U.S. law, but we still take military action against a country, against the UN treaty, without the provisions of being militarily attacked by that country, or being granted permission through the Security Council. So we see a violation of the Constitution, and what can an average person do about that?
I
I
think
would disagree a little bit with that statement. I would say that both chambers of Congress did vote to approve the authorization for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The vote took place in 2002, and in March of 2003, George Bush took that blank check, so to speak, and cashed it. The fact that it didn't say declare war, I would argue is kind of a semantic argument that's not really relevant. It did authorize the use of military force, and even Hillary Clinton voted for it. She later tried to claim that it shouldn't
didn't
count against her
understand the
because she was she felt like she was misled. Well, it takes two people for the lie to work, right? It takes the liar and the person who believes it. So I think that was a little disingenuous on her part. But the point is that Congress did authorize the use of military force, and the United Nations itself does not prevent the United States, or cannot prevent the United States from declaring
we're a
war on a
sovereign
particular state, right? It doesn't take away any U.S. sovereignty in that regard.
Can I address the old guard and that the baby boomers are controlling everything?
Yeah, about them dying off, and that would solve the unemployment problem too, wouldn't it?
Right.
Yeah, and everything will be fine when we die off.
I'm a baby boomer.
Oh, okay. You just pick
Old
up the pace.
soldier never die;
here.
they just fade away.
Well, I think the problem is that when you say that the older generation is the one that's stifling the conversation, I think that you're missing the point. Is that there's always going to be an older generation. We vote based on the situation that we're in. There's an old saying that if you're 20 and not a Democrat, you have no heart. If you're 40 and not a Republican, you have no head. And that's that. I didn't make it up. Don't shoot the messenger. But it's this idea, and we call it a generational effect in political science. And it is statistically sound that people vote based on the situation that you're in. Younger generations tend to vote more Democratic. Individuals who are single tend to vote more Democratic. Individuals who rent tend to vote more Democratic. And that's because as you get older, you graduate from college, you get more stuff, you make more money, you want to keep more of that money. So you tend to vote in a different direction. It's not a matter of your skin color or your socioeconomic status. A lot of that has to do with where you are in your generation. Middle-aged individuals are going to vote differently because now they have different responsibilities. You have children in school, you're more concerned about the local school district. You tend to maybe want to sit on the PTA, have a little bit more say in the books that are used to educate your children. You get a little bit older, now you're in retirement. Well, you want to make sure that your Medicare that you were promised and your Social Security that you were promised, and oh, by the way, I've been paying into this for 65 years. I'm entitled to this because I've been paying into it because that's the system that we created. There's always going to be another generation right behind it that has paid into the system and deserves that. So you're never going to get away from the old guard. because there's just going to be a new guard stepping into the old guard's shoes. And eventually that's going to be us. And then you're going to have the younger generation saying, well, you know, it's the old people that's stifling the conversation. No, it's the old people that are voting. And so, yeah, they're controlling the situation and the conversation. So my solution, again, is get your butt to the polls.
I think most Americans are centrist. Most Americans are willing to make progress. They do have the sense of progress, but they're more willing of making slow, incremental, gradual progress, not radical, not sweeping change.
And it's sustainable that way.
Yes.
Okay, got another question here.
I have a question about Obamacare and not being included with the General Welfare Clause, the Commerce Clause. In 1792, George Washington authorized a bill requiring all citizens, I think all male citizens, to carry a good musket. And that was under, I believe, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the respectively. So I guess my question is, if we use, at one point, our founding father, George Washington, had used the Constitution to require us to purchase something, why couldn't Obamacare be upheld in the same manner?
I thought it was. Oh, you're saying through Article 1, Section 8, through that particular paragraph, why wasn't that one used? Because
You said that it was because you wanted to know why the Commerce Clause wasn't relevant or supportive of Obamacare?
But Article 1, Section 8, paragraph 1, that allows the government, Congress to tax, essentially what Obamacare, even Obama's calling it Obamacare. The name is stuck. That's true, paragraph 1 in Article 1, Section 8, which is the power to tax, which is what the Supreme Court used rather than the Commerce Clause.
He wants to know why not the Commerce Clause.
Because, yeah.
Is that the question?
Yeah, the question is.
Okay.
I think the first part of your question about the welfare clause, right?
Yes, because the general welfare, basically, the welfare of the people.
But that's the preamble, and that's not a binding.
No, but Section 8 actually starts with the general welfare too.
Yeah,
right?
it does start with general welfare.
I think the argument here is that general welfare in terms of the healthcare in the United States already exists because there is a federal law that requires doctors and hospitals to treat people who are in medical emergency. And then the hospital and doctor are just, according to the law, they just have to stabilize you, which means you cannot die just that day, but maybe a few days later. But they don't have to heal you, right? So that's, I mean, some of my conservative students are saying, well, there is maybe there is not universal health insurance in the United States, but there's definitely universal health care. And they are referring to this particular federal law that requires medical profession to stabilize you. I don't know. My mother is a doctor. I know pretty well what healthcare is, and it's not going to emergency room for everything that you need, right? It's having a regular doctor who takes care for you 10, 20, 30 years, hopefully, if he is or she is alive that long, right? Why not Commerce Clause, right? Well, I think Commerce Clause is problematic both on account of the Supreme Court, right? John Roberts, the Chief Justice, said that this was problematic, but it's even more problematic than he said, right? If you read the Commerce Clause is regulating economic activity across state borders and across, also across national borders, right? But let us assume that you buy health insurance within the state and particular insurance companies within the state. Does the Commerce Clause apply? I think the Supreme Court, perhaps, if held under the gun, would say, well, any economic activity applies under Commerce Clause, right? Even if it is within the state, right? But the argument that Roberts read, and that was mainly his opinion, right? The argument that Roberts read in terms of the Obamacare was that there is no way in which people should be forced to enter a market, which is market for health insurance, right, without really wanting to enter it, right? So, because for them this was perceived as sort of a slippery slope. If the government forces you to buy health insurance, then they can basically force you to buy broccoli or Chevy Volt. But the government claimed that that healthcare market or health insurance market is a different one. So it's not the same like broccoli or Chevy Volt, right? It's a market in which all of us will use healthcare sooner or later, and not all of us will eat broccoli. And therefore, if we are not able to pay for the service, therefore others will pay for us through higher insurance premiums and for higher price, right? But Roberts said, well, Commerce Clause does not apply, but the power to tax does, right? So if you don't have health insurance starting in 2014, the government is going to slap you with a penalty. And Roberts said that this penalty could be interpreted as a tax, right? Despite the fact that the Obama administration was against calling it a tax. But Roberts said, oh, well, we can call it a tax because the Chief Justice Sarah Marshall always saw that it's always a good idea to seek on the Constitution how a certain law could be justified, regardless of the fact that appellant of that law may not even want to have this argument heard. Although in the arguments, Obama administration mentioned the possibility to interpret that penalty as a tax, but that was sort of a side argument. But Roberts, in his opinion, is saying that's the main argument. Interpreting this penalty that you will have to pay if you don't have health insurance in 2014 can be called a tax. And there is absolutely no limit in the Constitution that says how much government can tax you. There is no limit. The Constitution does not say that government cannot tax you for the things you don't want or need, right? The Constitution does not say that government cannot tax you only if you just sit at home and drink French cognac and smoke cigars, right? Government can even tax you in that particular, especially they can tax the cognac and cigars. But this is, personally, I think it's a very strange decision because it says, on the one hand, the government has to be constrained in its power to force you to buy stuff, but my question is, how come that the government is not constrained in its ability to tax? I think perhaps that was a political decision, which, by the way, I agree. And I think Roberts was basically looking for a plausible justification in the Constitution to justify the decision that he probably made before he even perhaps thought about the arguments. Also, that's just a speculation. Of course, I don't know that. As far as the George Washington is concerned, right? If you read the Constitution carefully, the Constitution is not telling you that you should buy a weapon, right? It doesn't mention muskets or guns or shotguns or anything like that, right? There was a law, right, that basically forced people to buy weapons in order to be able to defend whatever they were defending, right? But not the particular constitutional thing itself. Right? Why was that constitutional or not? We don't know because nobody challenged it. Right? So in order for the Supreme Court to say that something is constitutional or not, there has to be a test case. There has to be a case before the Supreme Court. Right? The Supreme Court cannot just go around states or talk to the federal government and say, look, what you just passed is unconstitutional. It doesn't work that way, right? So I would submit to you that if somebody challenged the order or law by George Washington, it might have been deemed unconstitutional as well.
Maybe I missed it, but if the Constitution, which is our topic today, says that Congress can regulate commerce, business, trade, in effect, how is healthcare not business, trade, commerce?
Because you may decide not to have healthcare, right? You may decide not to buy. So why would we penalize you for not buying something? Why would we penalize you for not buying a Chevy Volt? Why wouldn't we penalize you for not buying broccoli, right? Okay. So the law is saying that if you don't have health insurance in 2014, we're going to penalize you. And the 26 states were saying, well, that's wrong because the Congress is not allowed to penalize people for doing nothing.
But you can be forced to buy Social Security, a pension.
That's why. Let me add a few things.
Yeah.
I mean, on that day, I was listening to NPR. At the beginning, the radio says the whole thing was unconstitutional. Now, after a few hours later, they changed. They say John Roberts actually say the affordable health care is constitutional. Actually, there were two votes. Now, on the Commerce clause, John Roberts stood with conservative justices. That means, the Commerce clause does not apply. But the second vote was whether the tax, whether that should fall in the province of tax. In that case, John Roberts voted with the liberal justices. So they did not use Commerce clause, they used tax because everybody has to pay tax. And government has power to make people pay taxes, and that's the 16th Amendment. Now, but John Roberts says the tax is not penalty. The tax is used to encourage people to change their behavior. If you want health care, you have to change your behavior. You have to contribute. You have to pay into that. So it's encouragement, it's not penalty. That's the purpose of tax. I think another thing in that ruling is that John Roberts actually add a few things to the Constitution. He said the Supreme Court could modify the congressional legislation. I mean, that's kind of a very big change. John Roberts said if the constitutional bill or legislation is not clear, the Supreme Court can interpret, can add, can modify.
Yeah.
So that's something,
And Social Security and Medicare are taxes, not penalties. And therefore, in that particular interpretation, are constitutional.
So presumably, if the government provide universal health care coverage and made you pay for it then like Social Security would be allowed.
If you could interpret it as a tax and following this particular decision, then yes, there would be constitutional.
Okay.
Okay, in 1995, I believe it was, Congress passed, or it was 1986, Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act.
1996.
Okay,
Sorry.
Clinton administration.
it was, then a few years later, Congress attempted, a few members of Congress attempted to limit the federal court's ability to actually act on that, to rule it unconstitutional. I guess my question now is, does the Constitution directly say or indirectly say that Congress has the ability to moderate the federal courts in that manner because they are the guardians of the Constitution in many ways and respects?
The Constitution allows, did you say Congress? The ability to control the appeals that can be heard, because Congress creates the lower federal courts. So Congress giveth and Congress can taketh away. And so because they create those lower courts, especially the district courts, they can expand and contract the original jurisdiction of the district courts, as well as the appeals court, the Court of Appeals, and the appeals portion of the United States Supreme Court. So your question is whether or not they can restrict their ability to hear it? Yes. Oftentimes I get the different question is, or is DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, constitutional? And yeah, it is. Under Article 4 of the Constitution and the Full Faith and Credit Clause, at the very end of the Full Faith and Credit Clause, it says that Congress can prescribe the manner in which the contracts and agreements will be prescribed. So Congress can make those exceptions, and Congress can change the appellate jurisdiction of those courts. So I think
So DOMA is constitutional according to you?
yes.
Okay.
And
yeah.
that law defines the marriage, the meaning of marriage. According to Congress, marriage is a traditional union between a man and a woman. That's marriage. So if you got a union between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, that's not marriage. That's passed in 1996. Now, how many states have nullified or interposed that legislation? I'm not sure, but several states say, they go their own way
I
to
guess
define
my
marriage.
understanding of the Defense of Marriage Act isn't that it defines what marriage is. It leaves up to the states, which is appropriately where it's supposed to be because the Constitution doesn't mention marriage, that it's up to the states to determine how they recognize marriage. And under the Full Faith and Credit Clause, it's under Article 4 of the Constitution, which is an article that defines federalism and how the states will relate to each other. And the Full Faith and Credit Clause just says that one contract or decree or agreement in one state is recognized in another state. My understanding of DOMA is that it's almost a get-out-of-jail-free card for the states where they can, under DOMA, that states don't have to recognize the same-sex marriage of any other state should it choose not to. It's not my understanding that DOMA actually defines what marriage is. Of DOMA? Okay. I sit corrected.
It was challenged under the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment, and I think it was also challenged in another amendment, but I can't be sure.
But the federal government has never really waded in on marriage because marriage itself is controlled by the states. So my only assumption would be because of taxes, that the national government isn't going to recognize the same-sex marriage under the under the tax structure, maybe.
Yeah, it was. It had to do with Social Security, taxes, and stuff such as that, and military benefits.
Right.
More specifically.
Yes.
And that's where the challenge came in. It was also deemed as a states' rights issue if a state wishes to recognize a union, no matter who it be with, the state has the right to do that.
The state can, but they're not required to.
Yeah.
Cool.
By the way, Obama administration decided not to defend DOMA
Yes.
in courts. So that's one of the powers of executive powers. The executive order by the president says that they're not going to defend Defense of Marriage Act if attacked in court. So it's not being implemented.
Which begs to question whether or not that's constitutional, because isn't that exactly what we impeached a president over? For not enforcing a law?
Yeah.
Which president are you talking about? Bill Clinton?
No, he got in trouble for something very different.
He was implementing the law
Andrew
of
Johnson?
nature.
There's only been two.
Yes, and so it'd be the other one for
Andrew
refusing
Johnson.
the
Tenure of Office Act.
Tenure in Office Act. So it's under Article 2. The president has to take care to ensure that the laws are faithfully followed. Laws passed by Congress, he doesn't get to pick and choose which laws are enforced. However, the president can choose where his agenda is and set his priorities, and he might just say this isn't a priority for us.
My prediction is that the courts themselves will rule DOMA unconstitutional eventually.
You have to be very careful.
Any other questions? Well, I guess.
Don't worry, it's
Yeah.
called generational effect.
I know
Yeah,
that
well,
in my classes there are at least 5 future presidents of the United States.
Oh, good. Okay.
I'd like to go back to, I was kind of detecting a theme earlier that it's really not our Constitution that's the problem, but I'm detecting that it's really the citizenry that's the problem. They're not proactive enough. They're not involved enough. That it's the media, I heard, that was the problem. I
It's one
heard that it
part.
was our educational system that was the problem, but apparently the Constitution is absolved. And perhaps rightly so, but I think that there is some complaints about our political system, perhaps if not the Constitution, at least the way our democracy is being implemented. And I mean, take gerrymandering, for example. I mean, a lot of young people perhaps are turned off of voting because they feel like, what difference does it make? A Republican's going to win this district.
You are assuming that they know the difference between a Republican and a Democrat.
Yes, I'm assuming that, yes.
That's a lot of assumption.
But many people have pointed out that the way the congressional system is, the way Congress, the House of Representatives is gerrymandered means that there's so few districts that are actually really competed over, that for the vast majority of districts, it's a foregone conclusion which party is going to win automatically that congressional district. And so is there not something that can be done, if not changing the Constitution, at least some sort of reform that can be done nationwide that would break up this gerrymandered system that prevents, in many people's eyes, democracy from being realized, the real
You still get to
representation of the
vote.
people.
You still get to vote.
I got an idea. Mostly right now, the states get to decide where to draw the lines to form the districts. Can we let third-party, non-partisan commissions stay there and make decisions that will be fair and reasonable? So
To take
The
the partisan
challenge would be
politics
take
out of
over
it,
from state
Yeah.
governments.
more of a neutral way of
Yeah, neutral
selecting
way- neutral
congressional
way,
districts.
Yeah, to form the districts. And right now, just a few states, not all of them. If all of them follow the suit, I think this issue can be settled, can be solved.
But,
Gordan, I guess.
yeah, but I think some states are fairly innovative, and if you look at how American politics works, really, then you will see that states have always been sort of perceived as sites of political experimentation. And if you see a bunch of articles in the Constitution were basically taken from state constitutions that existed before the federal constitution, right? From the first 13 colonies, right? So, for example, in the states of Oregon and in the state of California, they have absolutely open primaries, which means that the primaries, well, for those of you who don't know, primaries are elections that choose the candidates who are going to run in general elections. So in the state of California and in the state of Oregon, there are no separate Democrat and Republican primaries. But there is only one primary, and the first two candidates who end up having the most vote in the primary basically compete against each other. So now, in the state of California, in some districts, we have the situation in which two Democrats compete against each other. Or in Oregon, where two Republicans compete against each other. And so, I mean, the genius of the American system is actually in federalism. And federalism is, to a great degree, prescribed by the Constitution, which allows states to basically experiment with political innovation, with creating new institutions and ways of doing things, without this some kind of a cranky bureaucratic mechanisms that would basically, I think, impede the liberty of the states and the liberty of individuals. Right?
Keith, actually, it brings me back to my original argument, that is the Congress has to be changed. Now, if you look at the size of states, California versus Wyoming, for example, I mean, each state has 2 senators. California is such a big state, which has like 35 million people. It has 2 senators. Wyoming has like 500,000. It still has 2 senators. So how do you apply one person, one vote? It's not proportion. So that's why, again, Congress has to be changed according to the times. In that case, California is underrepresented.
Yeah.
Wyoming is overrepresented.
It's undemocratic.
Undemocratic.
And that the Constitution could be made more democratic
Exactly.
if we made the Senate more proportional, or we did away with the Senate
Proportional.
altogether,
More proportional.
which would, of course,
Based
require
on
amending
maybe
the Constitution.
population, maybe. Large states you'll have more, small states you'll have less.
I'd like you to get to see the Senate agree to that. And actually, it's in the Constitution that the only part of the Constitution that cannot be changed is that you cannot take the 2 senators from each individual state without the permission of the state. It's the only part of the Constitution that cannot be changed.
That's true. That's true. That's why it should be changed. No, will be changed.
Only part that can't be amended is the only part that should be amended. Right?
Yeah, but I'm really skeptical about this argument about more democracy. I mean, we just agreed that most people are terribly informed, and terribly informed people make crappy choices. So why would we?
Which is why
why would we give them more choice, right?
Right. Which is why we do not want to get rid of the Electoral College. Yeah.
I agree with this thing that each state has 2 senators, because then small states have the opportunities to have, influence. If you look at how American political institutions are created, I think founding fathers, and I always wonder where mothers were, but founding fathers, or framers, better to call them, framers basically created a balance between protecting the power of the majority and preserving some power for the minorities, right? So if you take a look at democratic institutions, right, which are the institutions that represent majority, such as House of Representatives, then you have the number of representatives proportional to the population. But then you look at, I would call it the classical liberal institution, which is the Senate, and liberalism, classical politics, not liberalism of Democratic Party, but classical political liberalism of John Locke and Immanuel Kant, is going to tell you that basically minorities have to be well represented, right, too, or their rights have to be preserved, right? Because liberalism, classical political liberalism, starts from from individual, right? So individual, even regardless of how insignificant and small this individual is, also has to be preserved. So I think, and look at the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is absolutely undemocratic institution, right? Once these justices are put on the bench, they do not really have
for 50 years, not life.
any oversight. So I think this balance between representing and respecting the power of majority and preserving the rights of minority in the sense of those who are smaller than the majority in numbers is extremely important. And I think that's the genius of the American system. I don't think that democracy is the medicine for everything. If you take a look at the original Constitution, which means first 7 articles, you will see that framers were very skeptical of democracy. Right? The only House of Congress that was directly elected was House of Representatives. Right? Senate was not directly elected. If you look at Article 1, Senate was elected by the legislatures of the states, right? And President, as it still is today, is actually elected by the Electoral College. I mean, members of the Electoral College do not have any legal obligation towards the popular vote.
Wrong. Actually, some states do. 38
Okay,
states
all
have.
right. But constitutionally they don't. The
Constitutionally, no.
Yeah,
Only in the states.
Constitution does not tell the members of the Electoral College you have to vote in the same way as
But
your state.
that tells that
as your
the
states
framers had a fear of the people.
That's right, and I do have fear too. So that's why I'm saying the democracy is not necessarily the medicine for everything. I think the framers are fairly wise in balancing the will of the people, but also how should I say it? Also the competence of the elite.
It's filtering.
Ours,
Competence of the elite.
Ours, American democracy is not direct, pure democracy. American democracy is indirect,
Yeah.
representative, Republican.
Yeah.
So we choose our leaders, we choose representatives, and these representatives make rules in our names and on our behalf.
So it all comes back to,
So we have to keep
Us.
an eye on them.
yes.
Yeah, but as Hamilton or Madison, I don't know, there is disagreement who authored Federalist Paper number 52, whether Hamilton or Madison. If people were saints, we wouldn't need government, as Hamilton or Madison said, right? So having this balance of power and having the democracy in the sense that we have to hold our government accountable is our disbelief in the goodness of human nature, right? We're saying, well, we have these crappy leaders and they will always remain crappy if we do not control them, right? But if human nature was different, then we would not need democracy because we wouldn't need to control the leaders because they would be naturally good, right?
Yeah. And that's
which means caring about the goods of the community.
That's exactly why we need term limit. We can't let them stay forever. We have to let them serve for a number of years, and then they have to go.
But the term limits have gotten us into so much trouble in Michigan. I mean, we have term limits on our legislature and on our governor, which is all fine and dandy if they were staggered. But in Michigan, we had, what, a third of our House, a third of our Senate, and our governor change over in 2010. That would be the same year that we redistrict. And so it went from one chamber being controlled by Democrats, one being controlled by Republicans, and then a Democratic governor, to all Republicans. And they are the ones who redefine and redraw those district lines that will hold for the next 10 years. So term limits aren't necessarily a good thing. And personally, they're anti-democratic. I mean, you're changing the Constitution to limit the choice of the people. If a senator is doing a great job, he should continue to be elected. So if a senator is no longer doing his job, people should be smart enough and informed enough to not choose them, isn't it? Right? So if you institute a term limit, you're actually limiting the choice of the people. And
you punish good people.
Punish good people.
Yeah.
I mean, we have term limits in this country. They're called elections. And we actually have them every 2 years, not every 4. So.
Question over here.
I want to ask you in particular, Keith, because you lived in Illinois and you saw the Illinois government up close. The legislature that does not have term limits. I wonder if anyone on the panel or anyone else who's lived in both Michigan and a state that doesn't have term limits, if you'd like to compare the political culture they think flows from a state with term limits and one without.
Well, I said before that I'm opposed to term limits. I think that the problem with term limits in Michigan, and I got here too late to stop you guys from adopting that in your constitution, but the problem with it is that you have no institutional memory. Basically everybody's relatively new. I mean, your first term in office is really just figuring out what the job is, and so you've got 8 years you can serve in the state Senate, 6 years in the state House, and then you're out. And it's a lot of people didn't understand when they voted for that constitutional amendment in Michigan, implementing term limits. They didn't understand that it was a lifetime limit. It's not like, I mean, once you've served your 6 and you're done for good. You can never be elected to that chamber again for the rest of your life. So it is the most strict term limits in the United States, I believe. Mm-hmm. And what we've gotten instead is a relatively young or new class of state legislators who don't remember many of the same arguments that they are having now were argued 20 years ago, and there's no institutional memory. A lot of them are dependent then on the lobbyists to tell them how they should vote because they don't know the law well enough themselves, and they don't have the self-confidence and the tenure to believe that they don't need the money that lobbyists provide to get reelected. So I feel like really the group in Lansing that has been empowered by term limits has really been the lobbyist.
Well, and the whole point in instituting term limits, at least my understanding is, I couldn't vote at that point.
Well, it's not one term. For the House, it's 3 terms, 6 years.
Right.
For the Senate, it's 2 terms,
right.
12 years.
Right, but
eight in the state Senate.
Right, but the point is the whole reason why they instituted term limits was simply because they wanted interest groups and lobbyists to have less influence. And they felt very strongly that people were getting elected and they were in there for so long that they were heavily influenced and bought out by interest groups, much like our current House and Senate at the federal level. But the problem is, when you institute term limits, the only people who know now how to write legislation are the interest groups and the lobbyists. So we've actually shown, it's been statistically proven, that we are depending more now on interest groups and lobbyists to write our legislation because our legislators don't know how to do it, and by the time they learn it, it's time for them to leave. So, go Michigan. We could just have longer term limits, 15 years, 18 years, something like that.
Or none.
Be smart.
Or none at all.
Or none at all.
Is there a question over here?
Couple comments. First of all, I don't want to upset all the young folks in here. I still consider myself young, believe it or not, at 60. But to go along with a comment that Professor Sarah made, or Heather made a little while ago, I want to add to it. You don't grow a brain until you're 30 years old. Things that you were taught by your parents as far as politicians or political parties, generally, teenagers are rebellious, and in my case and in many other cases, I went the opposite way of my parents until I got to be about 30. The UN needs to be evicted from this country. I suggest it goes to Holland so that when global warming hits better, they go underwater. The building itself should be turned into housing for the poor people. Liberal media controls most of the time on television, unless you get it smarts enough to watch Fox News. And, oh, I lost my train of thought here. Time for me to shut up. Some young people can talk now.
I just want to say one thing before Heather say anything.
Can I just comment? I mean,
Winston Churchill said this: if you're not liberal at 20, you have no heart. If you're not conservative at 40, you have no mind.
well, I'm 47, and I'm offended.
Which way?
I mean, because I remember being under 30, and I would object to somebody telling me that I didn't have a brain, even at 21 or 18. And yet, I think the voting age should be lowered to 16, as a matter of fact, because I think we could teach them in high school. That's where you really engage them. That's where they start becoming politically aware. But I know I'm in the minority on that one.
I think the drinking age should be lowered to 18. If you can die for your country, you should be able to at least drink.
But do you have a question? You have a question? There is a question over there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, my question, I've heard each of you kind of indicate that there's things in the Constitution that you disagree with. What one thing bothers you that if you could change, you would do it, and why?
What about what about this one? I know you don't like this idea. What about, okay, American president must be from Native Americans. If you're not native born, or natural born, I should say, you cannot be the president. How about allowing the foreign-born Americans to be the president? I'm not going to run, for the president. but I'm foreign-born.
The Chinese American.
Then we could get Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Schwarzenegger, Jennifer Granholm.
I knew you'd like that one.
Anyway,
Okay.
just throw it
Not a
out
natural
for you
born
to
citizen.
think.
Gordan?
Yeah.
I don't know yet.
I don't know. I think Constitution is basically a poetic document, and it's poetic because it allows for wide interpretation. If you look at, especially, I think, first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, right? I think most people are fascinated with the freedom of speech, but they perceive this freedom of speech as absolute. They can say whatever they want at any time. And, we talk about that in class. Actually, I will talk about that with my classes next week. But what basically freedom of speech is telling you is the freedom of anti-government speech. is telling you that you can basically talk against the government, and the government shall not make any rules that will prevent you from doing that. But it doesn't tell you that your employer cannot prevent you, especially if it's a private employer. It doesn't tell you that a private school cannot prevent you from saying things. So perhaps in that particular sense, I would like the Constitution to be more precise. I think that the Constitution is, the main purpose of it is to constrain the power of the government, is to prevent what many conservative Americans call tyranny, tyranny from the government or by the government. But it's strange that in that particular sense, it doesn't really explicitly mentions the right to privacy. And when I ask people what does right to privacy mean, most of them tell me, oh, right to privacy, just to be private from intrusion from other people. I said, no, the right to privacy as interpreted by the Supreme Court, although the Constitution does not mention it, is the right to privacy from the unnecessary intrusion of government. So I can see why some people like the poetic nature of the Constitution, which means this broad, metaphorical nature of Constitution, because perhaps this is good because it could be applied without many changes, or could be interpreted without many changes over a long period of time, right? Yes, I mean, the Constitution was written in 1787, ratified 88, 89, so today is 2012, right, and we're still using it. Why? Primarily because of its poetic nature. But I think this poetic nature also has a flip side, and that flip side is that it may be wrongly interpreted and abused, and therefore perhaps lose some of its relevance. So I think perhaps I would like it to be more precise, but not overly precise in the sense that one would have to change it too many times so that it applies to the time. Yes. So, and I think something should be added. I think right to die should be added. If you are so terminally ill that there is no help. Some scholars are arguing that's within your right to privacy. The government cannot forbid you to die, and that's your private right. But that's not as clear, I think, as it could be. So I'm a little bit torn. I would like, on the one hand, more privacy, but not too much privacy. So not too much privacy. I would like a lot of privacy, but preciseness. I would like more preciseness, but not too much preciseness in the sense that it would constrain Constitution to serve us, I would say, fairly well over a long period of time.
If I could change, I don't think that I would take away anything. I would wish that the ERA would have been, the Equal Rights Amendment would have been ratified. It's unfortunate that that went up around the same time of Roe versus Wade, and it was connected to that, but you know, I think a lot of people lose sight, and yes, I understand. A lot of people lose sight that women got the right to vote fully 50 years after all males did. You know, we didn't get the right to vote until 1920, and if we don't start talking about the obvious, and that is, there is a definite gender gap in pay in this country. You know, being a single mom, it's tough. That it's just a tough area because I still have to provide for my child, and yet just because I was born a certain way that I have absolutely no control over, I'm treated differently because of that. That's frustrating. So I would have wished that the ERA would have been implemented. So, Equal Rights Amendment, I'm sorry, that women and men would be treated equally. But I still don't want to register for the draft. Can I have both?
No, not really.
Okay.
I'm
I'm just kidding.
If I could
I would have
change-
served in the military, but women couldn't serve couldn't fight on the front line, and I wanted to drive fighter things. They wouldn't let me, so. Truth. Come from a long line of military, so I would have done
It
it.
was meant to be protective, right? I mean, the reason why women were not allowed to do the same thing as men, pretty much in those days, the Congress believed women should be protected. Women should not do
I can
those
protect
strenuous
myself.
works.
I can
Women
hold a
should
gun
not
just
lift
as well as
heavy
anybody
weight.
else.
So pretty much it's protection intended, not a discrimination intended.
Yeah, but the whole point in protecting women was preservation of society, because we are the ones that have kids. Let's not kid ourselves here. The whole reason why we weren't allowed on the front line up until, what, 8, 10 years ago, was preservation of society. If men could have kids, we'd be thrown under the bus and put on the front line.
You never know with the advancement of medical technology. that
Hey,
might be
I am
possible.
ready to give up that responsibility and share that wealth. So, no, I mean, yeah, I get the whole idea of protectionism. I get the whole idea of women and the whole opening doors and chastity and all of that. But I still just think that it's 2012 and we should be beyond that, you know?
How I would change the Constitution, I'd go back, if I didn't convince you before, let me try again. I'd do away with term limits for president.
I agree.
It bothers me a lot that if President Barack Obama is reelected, that he will not have to worry or will not be able to compete for another term in office. And therefore, in my mind, he doesn't have to take as much into consideration about what the people want if in a second term as president. And that bothers me a lot, that presidents in their second term don't have to feel as accountable directly to the people. And
I think
I think that would be, we'd see a different presidency for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would agree 100%. Do you think Clinton would have done the same things that he did in his second term had he known he would have been able to run for re-election? Do you think President George W. Bush would have taken the same course had he known he could have run for re-election? I think there's a certain amount of accountability, knowing that you can run for re-election, is that it's an accountability to the people. And you definitely see presidents in their second term taking more risks because they know that they're done. And yeah, I would agree 100%.
Well, to me, I mean, it's not the second term, it's the last 2 months. It's lame duck. Because they know, they're going to leave. I mean, they have to transfer the power to the next one. So the last 2 months between November and January.
So you think it should be an immediate take?
Well, what I think is, they still have 2 terms, but for each term, it should be 6 years, not 4 years.
Oh.
More time for them to fulfill what they promised. If you got 4 years for one term, they will be busy, campaigning for the next term.
Mm-hmm.
Give them more time so that they can do more. So 2 terms, each 6 years, 12 years, and that's it.
So
But then you'd
you
have to
prefer
extend.
prefer that change to your previous one?
Yeah,
Which one?
I don't know. What?
Well, we were supposed to pick one thing that we would change
Oh.
about the Constitution.
But if you change the president to 6 years, you'd have to extend the Senate to 8. Quite simply because the framers were intentional about the staggered terms. 2 years for the House, 4 years for the president, 6 years for the Senate, so that you didn't get a complete transition. So, I don't know, you wouldn't get what Michigan just did. You'd think that Michigan would have learned something from our Constitution. Yeah, they didn't. So those staggered terms, if you extend the president to 6, you should extend the Senate to 8 so that you don't have a complete transition.
But think about it. You see how little trust framers of the Constitution had in the ability of ordinary people to do politics. The only house in Congress, or the only really elected office, chosen directly by the people is House of Representatives, right? And they have the shortest term, 2 years. Right? Senators were elected by the state legislatures in the original Constitution, and president is elected by the Electoral College. All basically selected by the elites. The only house in Congress elected directly by the people has the shortest term. Why? Because the framers didn't believe that people are capable of making good decisions.
It's also important to note, and I point this out to my students all the time, the people who could vote at ratification of the Constitution, 24 years old, white, landowning, males with a substantial amount of education because that translated into wealth. Who votes today? 24 years old or older. Landowners, people who own homes, vote more than renters. Males, a little bit more than women. And I don't know that there's a huge difference between African American and white voter turnout, but there is a huge difference between Latino voter turnout and Caucasian voter turnout, but a lot of that has to do with the language barrier. So a lot of the same people that they were restricting voting to are also the very same people who vote today. And we have a wide open range of people who can vote, and yet you still have those traditional people who own property, are better educated, who have higher incomes, who have more stuff, who are married, who have kids, traditionally turn out to vote more. So, I mean, how much have we progressed in 220 years?
I always think what can make the young people feel like they have something at stake so that they go and vote.
Student loans.
One thing that
Draft.
one thing that all voters will have at stake in this election is that the next president of the United States, regardless Obama or Romney, is going to have a huge influence on the Supreme Court because they are going to appoint, I think, at least 2 new justices to the Supreme Court. Right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg is fairly old. Unfortunately, she has pancreatic cancer, so most likely than not, she's going to retire very soon. And Kennedy, right? Justice Kennedy is going to perhaps to retire. So at least 2 new justices on the Supreme Court. Right now, we have what could be considered 4 liberal justices, 4 conservative justices, 1 swing vote. Right? So two new justices on either side will basically, to a great degree, decide what the Supreme Court does, how it decides, and where this country is going. Supreme Court basically makes huge decisions about social issues, about issues of elections, about issues of campaign financing, all extremely important issues for the future of this country. So this is a huge stake, your vote, the vote of, and out of us 4, only Jan is naturally a citizen. I'm not a citizen, so I cannot vote.
I can't be the president.
Right, but the vote of citizens will, to extremely high degree this time, determine the future of the country, not only in terms of the presidential policies, but also in terms of appointments to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
Gordan, I'm wondering, you talked about the poetic nature of the original Constitution. I'm wondering if you found the amendments to the Constitution equally poetic.
I think amendments are more poetic than, especially for Bill of Rights is more poetic than the first 7 articles.
Were ratified at the same
Especially
time.
Amendment 9. I think Amendment 9 is extremely poetic. It just has 1 sentence, and I think the whole book could be written about just 1
Numerate.
I would agree. It's an awesome amendment.
On the subject of the Supreme Court justices necessarily, there is no constitutional requirement for a Supreme Court justice. So necessarily, you could appoint a 15-year-old to the Supreme Court.
They'd
the only
never
thing
get through the
stopping
Senate.
There is a one requirement.
That's the
good
only
behavior.
thing stopping it.
Yeah.
Yes, they
Their
have to.
tenure based on good behavior.
And imagine how many 15-year-olds have good behavior. I don't think that you will find any.
Yeah. No, there are no requirements, but you just have to keep in mind that the vetting process through the Senate, and given the amount of influence, as Gordan was just talking about, that the Supreme Court has, if highly acclaimed and very well-educated people have a very hard time, you're never going to get anybody who isn't a lawyer, and you're never going to get anybody who doesn't have some kind of knowledge repertoire of the Constitution, because they'd never make it through the questioning. Just look at Harriet Myers. So.
But also think about this. There is nobody on the Supreme Court right now who is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. There is nobody who is running presidential campaign who is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? None of them. So
That's a very evil laugh.
and this country is, I mean, the Democratic Party, the internal thinking of Democratic Party is that regardless of win or lose this time around, they're going to have majorities in Congress and many Democratic presidents for a long time to come in the future. Why? Because they see demographics of the United States changing, right? In 25 years or less, there will be no racial majority in this country, in the sense that there will be no race in this country who has 50% or more participation in the whole population, right? So all of us are going to be minorities, right? And who captures these so-called minorities, especially the fastest growing ones, Hispanic and Asian Americans, they're going to capture the political power of the country. So far, Republican Party has not proved itself to be as successful as Democratic Party in capturing especially Hispanic and Asian vote, especially Hispanic vote, right? So internal thinking about in Democratic Party is, okay, we may lose this time, although I don't think so right now, but the future for us is guaranteed because we are the ones, I think what Jesse, right, what Jesse said, we are the ones who appreciate what Jesse, I think, called cultural diversity, right?
I disagree.
This country is changing about.
I don't think that Republicans have, or I don't think the Democrats have it set up. If you look in the last election, more Republican or more governorships went from Democrat to Republican in the United States, I think 8. And if we pull most of our, I will say most of our presidential candidates from gubernatorial seats, then Republicans are setting themselves up to have more experienced individuals running. Now, yes, I would agree with the demographics of that, but I would disagree that Republicans can't pull those votes in. You saw the Latino voters vote for President Clinton in 1996, or excuse me, in 1992 and 1996, but you also saw them vote for President Bush in both elections. And
That's
then
the
they
highest
voted
one.
for
President
Obama.
Bush got 41% of the Latino vote, which is the highest of all the presidents.
Right. So my prediction is
Highest of all
that,
the Republican presidents.
that the Republicans can definitely win the Latino vote if they get smart about their platform on immigration and stop denying that immigration is here to stay and that these individuals are not ignorant, that you can't group them all together. There is as much diversity in the Latino vote in the United States as there is in it's just incredible, the differences in Latinos. The one election that I am waiting for is 2016, and that is because I will predict, coming out in 4 years, 6 years, Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush.
We're going to play this tape for you in 2016.
Okay, go ahead. Jeb Bush, he is obviously older brother of Herbert Walker, or George W. Bush, governor of the state of Florida for a couple years. He's actually married to a Latina, speaks fluent Spanish, has biracial children, and has been hounding the GOP to lighten up their rhetoric on immigration because he understands that the future in this country is going to be handled by those people who are in the minority. However, Latinos also love the Clintons. So I think a true fight will be Clinton and Bush. And
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I just said it was internal thinking of the Democratic Party.
I can't wait.
How about calling this election?
Calling it right now?
Yeah.
You mean
State-
who wins?
Yes.
It's dangerous.
I kind of want to know because when
Who are they? I mean, like, no.
no,
It's too, I mean, I mean, anything can happen.
Intuition.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, there's credibility to the fact that the media was able to spin this, the death in the embassy and Romney's fumblings against him. But the fact of the matter is, we did have an ambassador overseas get murdered.
Still economy. If economy is improving,
Yeah.
Obama will be re-elected.
Well,
Now,
I don't know that it'll
people
improve.
say no president has been ever re-elected when the unemployment rate is below 7.3.
Below
I
or
mean,
above?
above,
Gotcha.
above 7.3.
It's 8.1 right now, right?
Right now it's 8.1.
1.
8.3. Except for Reagan. Reagan got elected 84.
Bush,
8.1.
Bush senior. I mean, that's 7.2. He lost.
Well,
Okay,
that
we
was
have
pro.
one final question.
Yeah.
He never asks questions,
Back
he just gives
again.
comments.
Yeah.
On the females in the military, I'm in full agreement with you that females should be in the military.
They
But
are in the military. I'm
Not
saying
on the front line,
Ah, okay.
because it destroys the cohesiveness of the unit. You talk to the people that have been there, they want to protect the woman. They're not doing their job. They're trying to protect her. I have personal experience with it. Back when ERA was going on in the 70s, I was in the military in Vietnam, and they put some women in my squad. I was a jet engine mechanic. They could not do the job. They could do the light work, but they could not do the heavy work. And so we had to take up their slack.
I agree with David.
Then they shouldn't be police officers. They shouldn't be firefighters. We shouldn't be in any position that would put us in harm's way or require us to do heavy lifting.
But
Right.
women
Or
can
get shot?
fly jets.
So no police
women
officers
can
that are
drive
cops?
tanks, or women.
But
can-
Oh, because combat and getting shot in combat is
Yeah,
different than
di-
getting
different
shot on the
thing,
streets on
different
the
thing.
south side on a Sunday at
but
3 in the
David,
morning.
David, do you know that
Okay.
Women
Just
are
checking.
allowed to work in the submarines? Just recently.
Well,
So we can drown.
we'll have to conclude.
I won't say anything, my wife will see the tapes. I won't
Yeah.
say anything.
He's afraid of Nina.
Yeah.
Well, that'll have to be the season finale for this year. But there's always
Thank
next
you
year.
all.
But I'd like to thank everybody for
Yes.
coming. Do remember when you leave, there are chances for you to register to vote for this exciting election coming up in November.
And my
So-
students get extra credit for voting.
For registering or for voting?
For voting.
There you have it. All right, thank
how,
you
how
all.
do you know they voted?
How do you know they voted?
They get the receipt.